3 years. That is how long it took. 3 years of Sunday lunches and birthday celebrations and candlelit dinners where someone always stood up and made a toast in my honor. 3 years of being embraced at the front door and sent home with containers of food I hadn't asked for, and called a blessing by a woman who looked at me like I was the answer to something she had been quietly praying about for a very long time. 12 people around a table. 12 people who use the word family the way you use something you believe in, with conviction, with warmth, with the ease of long practice. And between them, quietly, methodically, over 1,000 small moments that each felt entirely reasonable and each felt like an expression of genuine care, they took every pound I had. 510,000 pounds, my pension lump sum, the proceeds from the sale of my house, the savings that my wife, Patricia, and I had built together over 4 decades of ordinary, careful, faithful effort. Gone. Not lifted from my wallet while I was sleeping, not taken by threat or by force. Handed over by me, transfer by careful transfer, because I wanted so badly to belong somewhere again that I could not see what was happening even when the evidence was sitting right in front of my face, even when the number was growing into something that should have frightened me, even when a quiet voice somewhere at the back of my mind kept trying to form a sentence I was not yet willing to complete. My name is Dominic Hastings. I am 69 years old. I am from Manchester. And I need to tell you this story properly, from the beginning, because if I carry it inside for much longer, it is going to finish the job that family started. 31 years I gave to the same logistics company in Manchester. 31 years of early starts and late finishes and fluorescent-lit offices and the particular, unacknowledged satisfaction of watching a complicated system run cleanly because you built it well and kept it that way and refused, year after year, to let it fall apart. I was a regional operations manager, which sounds more impressive than it was in the day-to-day of it, and also less important than it was when measured against what happened after I left. The honest truth is this: I was the kind of man a large organization keeps for decades because he never causes drama, never demands more than he is given, never allows anything significant to collapse on his watch, and never once needs to be reminded what his responsibilities are or what he owes to the people depending on him. I knew every driver on my roster by name and by the particular habits that made them reliable or difficult or both at once. I knew which routes developed problems in winter and which distribution hubs had chronic staffing issues over the bank holidays. When something went wrong at 2 a.m, and in logistics, things always go wrong at 2 a.m, I was the one who answered the phone without complaint and fixed it without needing to be thanked. Not glamorous, not the kind of career that earns you articles or awards, just solid and present and entirely there. The kind of reliability that a company takes for granted until the day it disappears and then discovers it cannot easily replace. I walked out of that building for the last time carrying a bottle of whiskey with a bow on it and a card signed by 40 colleagues, and I stood in the car park for a moment in the drizzle and understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that I had no idea what the rest of my life was supposed to look like. I had been so completely defined by the job, by its rhythms, its demands, its way of telling me every single day who I was, and what I was needed for that retirement felt less like a reward and more like a kind of erasure. My colleagues had their families, their weekends full of noise and grandchildren and Sunday tables that needed a certain number of chairs. I had a quiet, semi-detached in Didsbury and a future that looked, from where I was standing, like a long corridor with no windows and no doors. Patricia had died 4 years before I retired. Pancreatic cancer. We had 14 months from the afternoon the consultant sat us down in his office and delivered the news with the careful, measured gravity of a man who performs this function more times than he probably expected when he went to medical school. To the morning I sat beside her in a hospice room in Salford and held her hand and felt, with a physical certainty I could not have anticipated and will never forget, the exact moment she left. I spent those 14 months being strong for her in the way that you choose to be strong when someone you love needs you to hold things together. I managed the medications and the appointments and the paperwork and the relationship with the hospice team and the conversations with her sister who lived in Scotland and who called every week and needed reassurance I did not always have to spare. I kept the house clean and warm and stocked with the food she could still eat, and I maintained the small domestic routines that gave her comfort when everything else was frightening. And somewhere underneath all of that, quietly, invisibly, without anyone nearby to witness it, I was dissolving. Patricia was my person. 38 years. We had met at 23 at a company social event that neither of us had particularly wanted to attend, and from that first evening there had been a quality of ease between us that I have spent a long time trying to articulate and have never quite managed. Not a dramatic falling in love. Something quieter than that, and more durable. A sense of being genuinely recognized by someone who was looking for exactly what you were. We tried for children in our 30s, went through all the appointments, the hope, the disappointment, the specific grief of a loss that is anticipated and then arrives anyway and hurts exactly as much as you feared it would. Eventually we accepted it and found our shape as the two of us, and built a whole life inside that shape, and the life was good and whole and enough. And then one of us was gone, and the structure that remained made no sense on its own. I went back to work the week after the funeral because work was the only place where I still understood what I was for. There were routes to manage and drivers to coordinate and problems to solve, and when I was inside the building and inside the function of the job, I could breathe without having to remind myself to do it. When I went home, I was just a man in a house that was too large and too quiet, making tea for one, watching television programs that dissolved in his memory before the credits finished rolling. I stayed at the company for 4 more years after Patricia died, and when I finally retired, I told myself that time would have softened things enough that the quiet would be manageable. It had softened nothing. The quiet got louder. The days got longer. I started to understand, in a way I never had before, why men my age simply fade, not because their bodies give out, but because they exhaust every reason they ever had to be fully present in the life they are still technically living. Terry Broadbent was the one who changed the direction I was heading. We had worked together for 15 years before he took early retirement and moved to the Philippines. We kept in touch in the loose way men do messages, a birthday text, calls that were always a little too short and a little too full of the things neither of us quite said. He rang me one Tuesday evening in February, about 8 months into my retirement, and talked for an hour about Manila and the expat community he had found there, and the quality of life he had built in a city that was warm and cheap and full of people who had no idea what gray felt like. He said he was lighter there than he had been in 30 years. Lighter was the word he used. I heard it and understood immediately what he meant, and also understood, with a particular precision, how far I was from feeling it. I told him he sounded like a holiday brochure. He laughed and told me to stop being stubborn and book a flight and stop waiting for my life to change from inside a house in Didsbury. 3 weeks later, I booked one. I told myself it was just a fortnight, just a holiday, just a way of breaking the sameness. What I was really doing, without the honesty to say it clearly, was going looking for something. I didn't yet know what. The heat came at me the moment the terminal doors at Manila opened, dense and wet and completely foreign to everything my body understood, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt something shift in my chest in a way I hadn't anticipated. Lighter, that was the word. Terry met me at arrivals with a grin that said he had expected this all along. He showed me his Manila over the following days, not the tourist version, the real one. The neighborhood restaurants and wet markets and small cafes where the food was extraordinary and the bill was almost nothing, and the staff knew Terry by name and said goodbye to him at the door with genuine warmth. He organized a community lunch with other expats, and I sat in a room full of British and American and European men, most of them in their 50s and 60s, more relaxed and more present than any comparable group of men I had encountered in England in years. I kept looking at them and trying to identify the quality they shared. Eventually I found it. These were men who had stopped waiting for their circumstances to improve and had simply moved to somewhere their circumstances already were better. I sat among them and thought, very quietly, that perhaps this was possible for me too, that perhaps the rest of my life did not have to be that corridor. It was at Terry's community lunch that I met Violet Cortez. She was introduced by one of his Filipino contacts as a social worker, a woman who had dedicated her career to supporting vulnerable families in Quezon City. The introduction carried a kind of implicit endorsement built into the professional description itself. Social work as a vocation implies choices made in favor of other people. It implies an ethical orientation, a willingness to put human welfare above personal convenience. I filed all of that away without examining how effectively it was doing its job. Violet was 38 years old, composed not coldly, but in the way of someone who knows where their own center of gravity is and lives close to it. She asked me sensible questions about Manchester and what had brought me here and whether I found the heat difficult. She listened to my answers with the kind of genuine attention that is rarer than it should be. She was not forming her next sentence while I spoke. She was actually taking in what I said and considering it. We talked for close to 2 hours. At the end of the lunch, she gave me her number and said that if I had questions about the country during my visit, she was happy to help. I thought about that offer for most of the drive back to the hotel and most of the evening after. Over the remaining days of my stay, we met for coffee twice and for dinner once. The coffee was at a small place near her office, where she was visibly at ease. Staff recognized her. She ordered without the menu. She tipped properly and said goodbye to people by name. Small details that register as character. The dinner was at a local restaurant, unpretentious and busy, where we sat for 3 hours and talked about her work and my career and the difference between a country where family is the central fact of a person's life and a country where it is one of many competing obligations. She spoke about her parents and siblings with the warmth of genuine familiarity rather than idealization. She acknowledged tensions, mentioned difficulties, did not pretend the household was perfect. That imperfection made it more convincing. She described Sunday lunches where everyone came without needing to be invited, week after week, not because it was scheduled, but because it was simply what the family did. I listened to her describe this and felt something ache in me that I had been carefully ignoring for years. By the time my 2 weeks ended, I had extended my stay by 10 days. When those ended, I had enrolled in a Tagalog language class and signed a 3-month lease on an apartment in Quezon City in the same neighborhood where Violet lived. I told Patrick it was an experiment. I told Terry it was practical cheaper to rent than to keep flying back and forth. What I was actually doing was following Violet, or more precisely, following the feeling that being near her produced in me, which was a feeling I had not had since before Patricia's diagnosis. I want to be honest about this. Violet had done nothing inappropriate. She had been warm and friendly and generous with her time. But I had already decided, somewhere below conscious awareness, that I wanted to be close to her. That decision was mine entirely, and everything that followed flowed directly from it. The 3 months in Quezon City deepened everything between us in a way that felt natural and easy. She would finish work in the early evenings and come to my apartment, and we would cook together. She taught me sinigang, and I taught her shepherd's pie, or sit on the balcony talking while the neighborhood darkened around us. I told her about Patricia, more than I had told anyone since the funeral. I told her because she asked questions that were gentle and specific and that made me feel the telling served a purpose rather than just being an unburdening. She listened without redirecting, without rushing me toward a conclusion, without deflecting into cheerfulness the way that uncomfortable people sometimes do. She simply let me speak, and that, more than anything else she did in those early months, was what made me trust her with the rest. At the end of the 3rd month, she suggested I meet her family. She said they were curious about the Englishman she had been spending time with. She said they were warm people and would make me feel welcome. I said yes without a moment's hesitation. That absence of hesitation is something I have examined many times since. A man with his faculties fully engaged might have noticed his own eagerness and thought carefully about where it was coming from. I did not. I bought wine and biscuits from an English import shop in the Expat district and turned up on a Sunday afternoon at a house in a quiet street in Quezon City, and the door opened, and I walked into the warmest room I had entered in 6 years. Conchita took both my hands when she opened the door and held them, and looked at me and said, "We have been waiting for you." Rodrigo's handshake had the grip of a man testing something and apparently approving of the result. Violet's brothers Arnell, the elder, broad and loud and immediately likable, and Ben, quieter and quicker to grin, welcomed me with the easy physical warmth of men who are genuinely comfortable around other people. Her sister Florinda embraced me as though resuming a friendship. Cousins' names came at me in a rapid sequence I could not absorb. Children ran between the legs of the adults. The table was covered in more food than 12 people could reasonably eat, which was itself a kind of statement, a declaration of abundance, a performance of generosity. Someone put a bottle of San Miguel in my hand before I had properly sat down. Rodrigo stood and made a toast in Tagalog that Violet translated as something like, "To our new friend, who has come from far away and is welcome at our table for as long as he chooses to stay." I sat at that table and something in me opened. After 6 years of one-person dinners in quiet houses and the specific grinding loneliness of a man who has lost his function and his companion at roughly the same time, here was the exact opposite of all of it. Noise, laughter, food moving in all directions, children, overlapping conversations, the sense of being inside something alive rather than permanently outside it looking in. I had been outside for so long that I had begun to think it was my fixed position in the world. And here was an entire family, 12 people around a wooden table saying, "Come in, sit down. You belong here now." I was not thinking clearly in that moment. I was feeling something I had forgotten I was capable of feeling, and people who knew what I was hungry for had just placed a feast in front of me. I went back every Sunday. I became a fixture. I brought gifts, chocolates, wine, English biscuits, and they were received with a warmth that was always slightly more than the gifts warranted, which I now understand was deliberate. I learned the children's names. I helped Arnell fix a leaking pipe in his kitchen because I was handy with basic repairs and it gave me a role, a function, a way of being useful that felt good and uncomplicated. I helped Ben assemble flat-pack shelves that had been sitting in his hallway for 3 months. I sat with Rodrigo in the garden after lunch and we talked the way men talk when the small conversation has run its course about work, about getting older, about whether you have used the time you had well. He engaged seriously with my thoughts. He remembered things I had said on previous Sundays and referred back to them. He made me feel that what I thought and felt and had experienced mattered to someone outside myself. I liked him deeply. I trusted him. I want to say that plainly and without apology. The trust was not foolish on the face of it. It was built over months of ordinary, accumulated interaction, and it felt like the trust you earn rather than the trust you manufacture. The first request came in the 5th month. We were alone in the garden after lunch, the family noise muffled through the walls, the Sunday afternoon quiet around us. Rodrigo told me he had been approached with a business opportunity. A cousin owned land in Bulacan that was suitable for a small commercial development, a row of market stalls that could generate steady rental income once built. The cousin needed a partner with capital. Rodrigo said he had been considering investing himself, but could not manage the full amount alone. He offered me a genuine business arrangement, not charity, not a loan, a partnership in something real with real returns. He said the amount needed from my side would be £95,000. He said it evenly, without pressure, the way a man presents a reasonable proposition between equals. I want to be completely honest about what I was thinking in that moment because it would be easy, looking back, to pretend I was simply deceived. I was not simply deceived. I wanted to say yes before the proposal was finished. My desire to agree arrived before the details did, and immediately my mind began building the case to support the agreement I had already made. He was not a stranger. He was the father of the woman I had come to care for. The proposition was not absurd. Land development in the Philippines was real. Expats made investments like this. Terry had mentioned knowing men who had done similar things successfully. I asked Violet that evening, and she said it was entirely my decision and that she did not want to influence me, but that her father was a careful man who thought things through. That sentence was the one I needed. It gave me permission to want what I already wanted. I transferred £95,000 within a fortnight. No contract, no documentation, no legal advice sought. I told myself this was cultural sensitivity, that demanding paperwork from a man who had welcomed me at his table would signal distrust, and distrust would damage the relationship I was protecting. The truth was simpler. I did not want any process that might disrupt the warmth of what I had found. I went to the next Sunday lunch and felt like a man who had invested wisely. The second request came 8 weeks later. Conchita came to my apartment alone and sat across from me with the posture of a woman carrying something she does not want to impose. She described a kidney condition she had been quietly managing for over a year that had recently worsened. She needed a private specialist in Manila, the tests, the consultations, the likely procedure. She mentioned the figure with her eyes toward the floor, in a voice so low it was almost inaudible. 85,000 pounds. Then she looked up and told me she was ashamed to ask, that she did not know who else to turn to. I did not ask for any documentation. I did not ask to see a medical report or a hospital estimate or any form of evidence that would have taken perhaps a single phone call to obtain. I looked at a woman who had held both my hands at her front door and told me I was an answer to her prayers, and I thought, what kind of man does not help his partner's mother when she is sitting in front of him too ashamed to meet his eye? I transferred the money within the week. That evening I felt good about myself in a way that I now understand was being carefully manufactured. I felt like a man of substance doing what a man of substance ought to do. That feeling was the reward being offered, and it was effective. Arnell came to me with Remy's university fees approximately 6 weeks after that. Remy, 19 years old, earnest and bright. The boy who sat beside me at Sunday lunches and asked questions about Manchester United with what seemed like genuine curiosity had been accepted into a private engineering program. 4 years. Full fees, accommodation, living costs, £120,000. Arnell said the family had contributed everything available. He used the word loan with particular emphasis, as though the word itself was a legal document, a guarantee, a moral structure that distinguished what he was asking from a request that had no expectation of return. The loan never came back. But in that moment the word was sufficient, because I needed it to be sufficient, because admitting that it wasn't would mean going back and looking at the 2 previous transfers and facing what they were starting to add up to. I shook Arnell's hand. I transferred £120,000. I called it an investment in a young man's future. I believed that, and then the cousins began. And once they began, they did not stop. Over the following 18 months, a rotation of relatives arrived in my life with difficulties that were always different in their specifics and always identical in their structure. A cousin whose husband had lost his job and who was at risk of losing the house, £35,000. A cousin requiring back surgery that the public hospital queue was too long to accommodate in time, £28,000. The family's fish business in Batangas, damaged in a typhoon, £42,000. Fertility treatment for a cousin's daughter, £31,000. Starting capital for a cousin's transport business vehicles needed, business plan explained in enthusiastic detail, £55,000. Legal fees for a property dispute that needed to be resolved urgently before a court deadline, £19,000. And more, the amounts varying, the stories varying, the apologetic framing always the same, always quiet, always embarrassed, always delivered with the sense that asking was something the person hated themselves for and only did because there was simply no other option. And every single time, the figure was large enough to require real resources from me, but not quite large enough to force me to stop and do the accounting that would have told me what was actually happening. Violet's role in this was the most important element of the whole system and also the most invisible. She almost never requested large amounts on her own behalf. Her contributions were subtler than that. She would mention a relative's situation with evident reluctance and then add quickly, "But please don't feel any obligation, Dominic." Truly, that instruction not to feel obligated produced the opposite of its stated effect. It framed my generosity as a free choice I was making from strength, not a response to pressure which made me more willing rather than less, and which preserved for both of us the fiction that I was acting from abundance rather than manipulation. She was the trust anchor around which everyone else was able to operate. My confidence in her, built over months of late evening conversations and shared meals, and the quality of listening she had offered me when I talked about Patricia, radiated outward to cover everyone connected to her. I extended to her family the trust I had given to her, automatically, because they were hers. I understand now how that mechanism worked. While it was working, I experienced it simply as warmth. There were moments of unease, moments when something shifted in my stomach and a thought began to form that I could feel myself suppressing before it finished. I would notice the beginning of doubt, and then, with a precision I did not perceive at the time, something would arrive to dissolve it. A particularly warm Sunday, a phone call from Conchita saying she was thinking of me, a moment with Violet on the balcony where she said she was proud of the person I was and meant it with enough conviction that I felt the words physically. These arrivals were not random. Looking back, the warmth had a schedule. It peaked at the moments my doubt was forming. It arrived precisely when it was most needed to keep me compliant and willing and grateful and unable to look at things clearly. That scheduling was not accidental. It was the most sophisticated part of the whole operation, and I was inside it completely. Patrick called from Manchester in the spring of my second year. He had been watching the pattern of international transfers from my accounts and was concerned. He spoke with the measured care of a professional who is obligated to raise what he sees without being able to compel action. He said the rate of withdrawal was alarming. He said he had spoken to a colleague experienced in expatriate financial matters. He asked me what I was doing with the money. I told him I was investing in local businesses and supporting people I had come to care about. He said that description could cover many things, some of which warranted serious concern. I thanked him and said I would be in touch. Then I hung up and spent the rest of the week resenting him. I felt surveilled. I felt as though someone at home was trying to assert control over a life I had finally, after years of misery, managed to build for myself. I went to Sunday lunch and felt entirely righteous about my independence. I did not call Patrick back for another year. The moment that cracked everything open was a man named Ferdy, a cousin. I had met him perhaps 4 times across 3 years. He came to me with a story about a business partner who had defrauded him and a legal case that needed filing urgently or the window would close. He needed £55,000. He sat across from me and I listened and I felt nothing. No warmth, no surge of generosity, no instinct to make his problem my problem. Just a flat, gray, exhausted nothing. And in that flatness, very clearly, rising through it like something that had been waiting patiently for the right conditions, I don't believe you. It was the first time I had thought that about anyone in that family. The thought frightened me in a way I hadn't expected because I understood immediately what it implied. If I didn't believe Ferdy, the question was not whether Ferdy was lying. The question was how many of the others I had actually believed versus chosen not to disbelieve. That question had an answer waiting for me, and the answer would cost me something significant to look at. I told Ferdy I needed a few days. He looked at me differently than he had before, a faint, recalibrating coldness behind the eyes, the look of someone whose calculation has just changed. He said, of course, and left. That evening I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad and did the thing I had been avoiding for 2 years. I wrote down every name, every amount, every stated reason. I added it carefully and checked it twice, and then added it again because the total that kept appearing seemed impossible. It was not impossible. It was correct. £510,000. I sat with that number in the quiet of the kitchen and I thought about Patrick's phone call. I thought about exactly how I had felt when I ended it, the particular quality of the resentment, what it had been protecting. I thought about every Sunday lunch and every warm arrival of warmth just as doubt was rising. I thought about the man who had sat at a table in Quezon City and felt himself belong, and I tried to look at him clearly, and I found that I could not decide whether I pitied him or understood him too well to do anything so simple as pity. I called Patrick the next morning. He answered quickly. When I told him the total figure, there was a silence that was not surprise, it was recognition. He spoke for 40 minutes. He described what I had experienced as a documented pattern, an organized family fraud anchored by a romantic relationship in which a rotating series of family members extract funds from a foreign individual through a succession of individually plausible requests. The mechanism was the size and variety of the family, enough different people, enough different situations, that the accumulation was never examined as a whole. The woman at the center was always the critical component. He told me to stop all transfers immediately, say nothing to anyone in the family, and speak to a legal advisor in Manila about my options. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and went through every memory I had of that family every Sunday, every embrace, every moment when the warmth had arrived with such precision, looking for the seams, looking for the places where the performance had slipped or the mechanism had shown itself. I could not find them. They were either that good, or the warmth was real and the theft was also real, and both existed simultaneously inside the same people, which is the most unsettling possibility and the one I still cannot fully resolve. I watched Violet for 4 days without saying anything. She was unchanged, the same warmth, the same attentiveness, the same quality of being fully present in a conversation. She brought food one evening and sat with me and talked about a family and her caseload she was trying to help through an eviction threat. She was genuinely troubled by their situation, genuinely invested in the injustice of it. I watched her speak and could not see anything that was not real, and that inability to find the seam was its own particular devastation. On the 5th day, I asked her to sit down. I kept my voice level. I told her I had been reviewing my finances and that I had arrived at a total of what I had transferred to members of her family over the previous 3 years. I said the figure plainly. I watched her face while I said it. She did not flinch. That was the moment. A woman hearing that number for the first time, a woman outside this, a woman who had not known would have had a reaction that landed visibly on her face. Shock, distress, immediate, disoriented questions. Violet looked at me steadily and said she had not realized the amounts were so significant that she was concerned about my well-being and that she would speak to her family. She said it with a smoothness that was not mechanical but was rehearsed, prepared for, anticipated, arrived at in advance. Not the response of someone blindsided, the response of someone managing. I said, "Violet, I just need to know. Was any of it real?" She said, "Of course it was real, Dominic. I care about you." I believe she believed what she said. I do not know, even now, the full shape of what she knew, or when she knew it, or what role she played consciously versus what she had simply learned to accommodate without looking at directly. What I know is that when I looked at her face in that moment, I saw someone managing a conversation rather than someone encountering it for the first time. Those are not the same face. The legal advisor I found in Manila had spent over 20 years in Philippine law and listened to my account with the quiet, focused attention of a man who had heard variations of it before. He told me that recovery was very difficult in these circumstances. Without contracts, without documentary evidence of organized fraud, rather than a pattern of voluntary transfers to known individuals, my legal options were limited. He could file complaints, but the process would be long and expensive, and the likelihood of meaningful financial recovery was low, he said. And I have thought about this many times since. In situations like these, the only thing that can be recovered quickly is your own clarity. I stopped going to Sunday lunches without explanation. The calls came in from Conchita, from Arnell, from cousins I barely remembered, each one expressing concern, each asking if I was all right, if something had happened, if there was anything they could do. I returned none of them. Violet came to my apartment once. I let her in. We sat at the table in a silence that carried more than either of us was going to say. She told me she hoped we could find a way through this. I told her I needed time. She nodded and left. I watched her walk down the corridor and understood, with a completeness that came quietly rather than dramatically, that I would not see her again. I was right. 2 months later, I moved out of Quezon City, a quieter part of the city, far enough from her neighborhood that running into anyone from that family would require deliberate effort. Terry helped me move the small number of things I had. When it was done, he bought me breakfast at a place he liked by the water and said very little, which was exactly what the moment needed. Patrick flew out from Manchester shortly after. We spent 3 days going through what remained. The pension lump sum was gone. The house proceeds were gone. The savings Patricia and I had built over 40 years of careful, ordinary living mostly gone. What remained was enough to live modestly for some years if I was careful. Not enough to rebuild anything resembling the retirement I had planned. Patrick reorganized what was left with his characteristic, unflashy competence and did not once say the thing that he had every right to say. I will carry that for the rest of my life. I am still in the Philippines. This surprises people. They expect the logical response to this story would be to fly back to England and attempt to reconstruct something from what remains. But there is nothing to reconstruct there. The house is sold. Patricia is gone. The colleagues who signed my retirement card have their own lives, their own full weekends, their own tables. Going back means starting from nothing in a country that would be colder and quieter and where I would feel the loss of all of it even more acutely. Here at least the mornings are warm and the coffee is good, and Terry meets me on Sundays at a place by the water where the food is simple and honest and nobody at the table wants anything from me except company. I have not been in another relationship since Violet. I do not know if I will be. Not because I have given up on people as a category, but because I now understand the geography of my own vulnerability with a precision I lacked before the specific shape of the need that was found and exploited. The way a loneliness that has been sustained long enough will find reasons to trust where trust has not been earned, will construct justifications for believing what it needs to believe, will dismiss every instinct that threatens the arrangement it has decided to protect. A man who wants something badly enough will build the trap himself. The other people barely have to do anything except show up and be warm. I think about Patricia. I think about what she would have seen that I didn't. She was sharper than me in the ways that mattered most, slower to warm, quicker to identify a room's actual temperature beneath its apparent one, constitutionally suspicious of warmth that arrived without having been earned over time. She would have sat at that first Sunday lunch and found the seams I could not find. She would have said something precise and uncomfortable and entirely right on the drive home, and I would have bristled at it, and she would have been correct, and we would have been 510,000 pounds better off, and I would have spent the rest of my life oblivious to the narrowness of my own escape. But Patricia is gone, and the man who survived her is still here, diminished in certain ways, quieter, carrying something that has not lightened with time but that he has learned, slowly and imperfectly, to carry without being destroyed by it. I am 69 years old. I have some time left, and I intend to use it as honestly as I can manage, not in bitterness, not in the kind of permanent suspicion that closes a person off from everything worth having, in clarity, in the understanding that belonging cannot be purchased, that warmth that arrives with a schedule is not the same as warmth that is freely given, and that a family which welcomes you completely in the first week is a family that has already decided what you are worth to them and is simply working out the timeline of the extraction. The table is smaller now, 2 chairs, mine and Terry's on Sundays. No toasts in my honor, no one calling me Kuya, no containers of food pressed into my hands at the door. Just 2 men and honest conversation, and a view of the water and a bill that nobody is calculating against me. It is not what I imagined when I landed in Manila 3 years ago. Hollow with grief and shaking with loneliness, looking up at a sky that was warm even in February and thinking that perhaps there was still something left to find. It is not what I imagined, but it is real. And after 510,000 pounds, after 3 years, after everything real is the only currency I have left that means anything at all, there is something I have not said yet, and I need to say it because it is part of the story in a way I find difficult to admit. While all of this was happening, while the transfers were accumulating and the requests were arriving, and I was convincing myself that each one made sense, I was also changing physically. I was losing weight I had not decided to lose. I was not sleeping well, which I attributed to the heat, though I had never had trouble sleeping in heat before. I was losing interest in the things that had occupied me when I first arrived, the language classes, the walks through the neighborhood, the early mornings at the coffee shop near my apartment where I had fallen into the habit of reading for an hour before the day properly started. I stopped going to those mornings without noticing I had stopped. I stopped calling friends in Manchester almost entirely because every call required me to perform a version of my life here that I was no longer certain was accurate, and the performance was exhausting in a way the truth would not have been. I was shrinking, not dramatically, not in a way anyone who didn't know me well would have noticed, but I was contracting around something I had decided not to look at, and the energy required to maintain that decision was costing me more than I understood. Terry noticed before I did. He came to my apartment one evening in my 3rd year, an unannounced visit, which was unlike him, and sat down and looked at me carefully and said, "Dom, you don't look right." I told him I was fine. He said, "I know you well enough to know when you're not fine, and you're not fine." I told him everything was good. He poured us each a drink and sat back and said, "I'm going to ask you something and I need you to be honest. How much money have you given this family?" I told him I didn't have a precise figure to hand. He said, "Roughly." I gave him a rough figure that was significantly lower than the actual one, and even at that reduced number I watched something change in his expression that I chose to ignore. He said he was concerned. He said he had heard similar stories from other expats over the years, men who got drawn into a family situation, men whose generosity was interpreted as a resource rather than a gesture. He said it carefully, without accusation, giving me every opportunity to push back rather than hear it. I told him he was being uncharitable. He said he hoped he was. We finished our drinks and he left, and I sat in the apartment afterwards feeling something I was not yet ready to call by its name. What I felt was fear, not the sharp, recognizable fear of an immediate threat, the slow, cold fear of a man who is beginning to understand that the thing he has been protecting might not have been worth protecting, and that the protection has cost him things he cannot get back. I sat with that feeling for a while, and then I put it somewhere out of reach. The way you put something in a drawer and push the drawer closed and tell yourself you will deal with it later. And I went to bed and lay awake for a long time. And in the morning I transferred 42,000 pounds to help with the typhoon damage to a cousin's fish business in Batangas. And I felt better almost immediately. That is the most shameful part of this. The transfers had become a kind of medication. Each one restored, briefly, the sense that I was needed and valued and doing something good with my life. Each one bought me a few more weeks inside the version of myself I had decided to be in the Philippines. The withdrawals hurt. The feeling of belonging that arrived after each transfer was the relief that made the hurt worthwhile. I understand now what that is. I do not have a less clinical word for it. Arnell's wife, a small, quiet woman named Gemma, who had always been kind to me without being warm in the way the others were, left the room once when a request was being made. I noticed it at the time and filed it away as unrelated. She needed to check on the food, or one of the children had called her. Looking back, I think she was removing herself from a transaction she did not want to witness. There were small moments like that, moments when the performance had the faintest stress fracture in it, visible only in retrospect. The cousin who came to me with the legal fees and could not quite remember the name of the lawyer handling the case. The way Rodrigo, when I once asked casually about the progress of the Bulacan development, changed the subject with a fluency that was just fractionally too smooth. Conchita, on the occasion I asked if her kidney condition was improving after the treatment, telling me yes, much better, before I had finished the sentence, as though she had the answer ready rather than reaching for it. These things were each, individually, explainable. Together, in retrospect, they drew a map I had refused to read. The Sunday lunches had a quality I could only identify after I had stopped attending them. They were performances, not cold or mechanical, nothing so obvious as that, but they were constructed. The warmth was real, in the sense that real warmth was deployed, real effort was made, real generosity was expressed in the food and the toasts and the embraces. But the warmth was also instrumental. It was there to do a job, and the job it was doing was keeping me in my seat at that table, comfortable and grateful and unwilling to examine anything too carefully. I was the most valuable guest that family had ever hosted, not because of who I was, but because of what I represented. A British pension, a house sale, 40 years of savings, and a grief so large and so long-standing that it had made me porous in exactly the ways they needed me to be. I do not believe they set out from the beginning with a fully formed plan. I think it began more organically than that. Violet met a lonely British man, found him agreeable, saw that he was generous, mentioned his generosity to her family, and then watched the family's ingenuity take over. I think the system evolved. I think each successful request made the next one easier to frame and easier for me to comply with. I think by the end of it, they had developed a quite sophisticated operation without ever sitting down and drawing up a strategy, simply because the feedback from the previous attempt told them what to do next. Or I could be wrong. I could be giving them more credit for organization than they deserve and less credit for genuine human complexity than is fair. Perhaps some of them cared about me in some real way and also took the money, because human beings are capable of holding contradictions with more ease than we like to admit. Perhaps Conchita took my hand at the door and felt something real, and also calculated the opportunity. Perhaps Violet sat on the balcony and told me she was proud of the man I was and meant it, and also knew what her family was doing and had decided not to examine that knowledge too closely. Perhaps the warmth and the theft were not opposite things, but rather different expressions of the same complicated family, some of whose members were simply more deliberate about the taking than others. None of this changes what happened to the money. It only changes the moral weight of it, which I have decided I do not have the right or the certainty to fully assign from where I am sitting. What I have the right to say is what happened to me, and what happened to me is that I lost everything I had saved, everything my wife and I had built, everything that was supposed to carry me through the years I have remaining, in exchange for 3 years of Sunday lunches and the feeling temporary, manufactured, ultimately hollow that I was somebody's kuya, that I was inside something, that I was not alone. I was alone the entire time. I was just alone in a room full of people, which is a different and in some ways worse version of the thing. After I moved out of Quezon City, after the calls stopped and the silence settled in, I spent several weeks in a state I can only describe as a kind of depressurization. The absence of the Sunday structure was physical. I felt it in my body. Every Sunday for 3 years I had had somewhere to be, someone who wanted me there, a table to sit at and food to eat and noise to be inside. And then suddenly there was nothing. Just an apartment in a quieter neighborhood and the ceiling and Terry's number in my phone that I sometimes looked at and did not call because I did not yet know how to describe what I was feeling in a way that would make sense to another person. I walked a lot during those weeks. Long walks through parts of the city I had not explored, through markets and along the seafront and into neighborhoods where nobody knew me and nobody was calculating anything. The anonymity was a relief. Nobody in those streets knew what I had done. Nobody knew the number. Nobody looked at me with the particular quality of warmth that I now understood as something other than warmth. I started reading again, something I had largely abandoned during the 3 years in Quezon City, where evenings had been absorbed by the family. I started cooking for myself again, which I had also largely given up. I started walking to the coffee shop near my new apartment in the early mornings and sitting with a book for an hour. And after a few weeks, the woman who ran the place knew my order and nodded when I came in. And there was a quality of recognition in that nod, uncomplicated, undemanding, real, that I found unexpectedly valuable. Small things, honest, small, unperformed things. I had not understood, while I was inside the warmth of the Cortez household, how exhausting a performance of belonging is, even when you are not the one performing it. Being the audience costs you something too. Terry and I talked properly, for the first time about 6 weeks after I moved. We sat at the place by the water, and I told him everything, all the way through, and he listened without interrupting for a long time. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm sorry I didn't push harder when I had the chance." I told him it wasn't his fault. He had tried, in the way a friend tries when they are not certain their concern will be welcomed carefully, without forcing it, leaving me the option to refuse. I had refused it. That was mine. All of it was mine, in the end. The wanting, the refusing to look, the transfers, the years all mine. What they did, they could only do because I made it possible. And making it possible was a choice I made, over and over again, with information that could have told me different things if I had been willing to read it. Patrick reorganized my finances with care and without sentiment. He set up a simple structure that would allow me to live modestly and without anxiety for a reasonable period, if I was careful and if nothing went drastically wrong with my health. He did not say what we both knew, which was that the margin was gone. The safety net that Patricia and I had spent our working lives constructing, the buffer that was supposed to make the last years easy, that was gone, and it was not coming back, and the years ahead would require a kind of careful, attentive management that retirement is not supposed to demand. He flew back to Manchester and left me with a spreadsheet and a handshake and the knowledge that I was fortunate to have someone like him in my life, which is a thing I had always known, but which I now knew in a different and more grateful register. I am 69 years old. I have, if things go reasonably, perhaps 15 years left. 15 years in which to live as clearly and as honestly as I can manage. Not in the shadow of what happened, though the shadow is real and some days it falls further than others. Not in bitterness, not in the kind of closed-off suspicion that would be the final gift I gave to 12 people who have already taken enough from me. In clarity, in the smaller, realer life that is available to me now. In the Sunday mornings by the water with Terry, where the coffee is good and the view is the same every week, and nothing about the conversation is constructed to produce a particular effect in me. I think sometimes about the version of this story in which Patricia had lived, in which I retired into a life that still had her in it, and the years abroad, if there had been years abroad, would have been something we did together carefully, with her particular sharp-eyed attention to the temperature beneath the apparent temperature of a room. In that version, I am not sitting in a cafe in Manila writing this in my head. In that version, I am probably in our garden in Didsbury, or walking a coastal path somewhere in Wales, or arguing with her good-naturedly about something small and domestic and entirely inconsequential. In that version, £510,000 is still mine, and Patricia is still alive, and everything is different. But that version is not available to me. This one is. And in this one, smaller, harder, more expensive than it should have been, I am still here, still learning, still capable, some mornings, of sitting by the water with a cup of coffee and feeling, not happily, but honestly, that the day in front of me belongs to me, that no one has a claim on it, that what I give today, my attention, my time, my presence at a table, I give because I choose to, and not because I am afraid of what withdrawing it will cost me. That is not a small thing. At 69, having paid what I paid to learn it, that is not a small thing at all.